Pride/Prejudice, Chapter 4, Segment 3. Once back at home, Elizabeth tried a dozen times to tell Jane of what she had heard and seen, but could not bring herself to do it. Jane was sweet and innocent and trusting. She would be too ready to forgive, to understand, and to hope, where hope was not, perhaps, her ally. No, someone else was better suited to hear Elizabeth's concerns. "You acted rightly," Charlotte Lucas said with her unflappable serenity. "The only way you could have. Jane is, in some respects, the younger sister to you. You can comprehend complexity in a man's character, where she, with her untried, unworldly nature, would only be confused." "Can I?" Elizabeth said. "But suppose it to fall out as I wish. Suppose Mr. Bingley does love Jane, and they marry. How are they to live together with this unspoken transgression between them?" "Oh," Charlotte laughed and shook her head, "I forget our difference of age in our soul's equal companionship. How should any marriage succeed? What man of the world comes to his bride unproven in the field of amour? What gentleman of 23 has committed no indiscretions? But he does not insult his wife by cataloguing them for her." "But this," Elizabeth said, "surely this is worse." "How so?" Charlotte replied. "How is being loved by a handsome, wealthy friend, a gentleman of the highest standing, any worse than the usual run of such affairs?" "Because," Elizabeth said, listening to her answer as if to test for the flaw, "to commit a youthful indiscretion or two, with a woman, may be seen as the natural course of a gentleman's maturation, but to do that with one of his own sex—" Charlotte hushed her with a touch of gloved hand on her lips. "Lizzie," she whispered, "think, how is it different from what we share?" Elizabeth felt herself blushing. "You swore," she said, "as did I, never to speak of it out loud." "I am speaking of it now," Charlotte said, her face looking somehow prettier and more dignified as she lost her habitual placid smile, "because you seem to have renounced it. Were all your sighs of pleasure, your protestations of devotion, merely the ploys of a fickle girl?" "No," Elizabeth said, more forcefully than intended. She glanced about, afraid that behind a thick tree trunk, or around the edge of the field, hidden by the stand of corn, there lurked a listener, as she in the corridor that fateful night, but was reassured by the lonely vista, the solitude of the country lane they had chosen for their conversation. "Charlotte, you know my feelings. I would never pretend with you. I just don't see that the innocent love between women is the same as men's— you know I can't say the word." "Sodomy?" Charlotte said. "No, in law you are correct. Men are prosecuted for loving one another, while we women are ignored. It is one of the very few times, perhaps the only one, where the law errs in our favor. But in spirit, Lizzie, in spirit, use your wits and tell me, just how is what your amiable, comfortable Mr. Bingley and your clever, scornful Mr. Darcy do with each other so different from our intimacies, and unforgivable?" "Unforgivable?" Elizabeth looked up from the ground in surprise. "I don't think that. You implied that Jane would not forgive it if she knew." Charlotte said. "Not at all," Elizabeth said. "I'm afraid she will forgive, and accept too easily. I can forgive, but it is she who is wronged by it." "How wronged?" Charlotte said. "But it is for him to tell if he chooses, although I would not recommend it. There is no reason they cannot have a happy marriage. It is common enough, I assure you, and has little effect on a gentleman's eventual choice to marry or remain single." "If you say so," Elizabeth said, "but you speak with such authority on a subject where it seems you can have no more direct knowledge than I." Charlotte shrugged. "One of the advantages of having brothers. I am given a window into the minds of young men, whether I wish it or not. Even my father contributes to my education. From everything he says, if all the sodomites in London were not to marry, the city would be a vast, unpopulated desert, its business and trade dwindled to little more than the barter of a primitive tribe, the court unattended, and the theatres boarded up, as bad as in the time of Oliver Cromwell." "Stop," Elizabeth said, choking on her laughter. "You're shamming me. He can't say such things. I don't believe it." thinking of pompous, silly Sir William Lucas, with his endless and repetitive stories of his brief, glorious presentation at St. James's, expounding to his wife and children on the natural acceptability of sodomy in London, she felt ready to expire with hilarity. "I am not shamming," Charlotte said. "Oh, he does not say it quite so openly, but I can put two and two together, and I read the newspapers. When he relays the tittle-tattle from his old associates in town, how this Lord so-and-so and that Mr. such-and-such are perpetually in each other's company, and how they and their friends frequent this house or that, and all of them with wives and families, I do not see how Mr. Bingley will suffer any hardship." "It is Jane's hardship I worry about, not his," said Elizabeth. "I still don't see how it matters," Charlotte said. "Once they marry, he and Jane will set up their own household." "Like Mr. Bingley's married sister, Mrs. Hurst, and her husband?" Elizabeth said. I hadn't thought of that," Charlotte said. "But most likely Mr. Darcy would go back to his own estate, or to town. He would resent the affront." "Yes, you're right about that," Elizabeth said. "In fact, it would probably be prudent if Mr. Bingley and Jane went abroad directly after the wedding, somewhere very far away, just to be on the safe side." It was only when Elizabeth returned home, flushed and languid with the afterglow of pleasure, and was roundly scolded by her mother for her green gown, the inevitable result of lying on damp grass, that she felt genuine fear. "If I had not seen you with that poor, plain Charlotte Lucas, I would suppose you were meeting some man, although who there could be, other than that disagreeable, proud Mr. Whatever his fine name, who snubbed you at the assembly, I can't imagine," Mrs. Bennet rattled on, while Kitty and Lydia sniggered. The dangers of a particular friendship, Mary had to utter her tuppence worth of specious philosophy for the day, are well known for men, but of equal, if not greater peril for women. Man is the master in matrimony. Should a woman demonstrate an independence of masculine rule, she renders herself unfit for the wifely station. "Oh, do shut up," Lydia said. "You're just being spiteful because you don't have a particular friend of your own." "Thank you, Lydia," Elizabeth said. "I think we've had quite enough of particular friends for 1 week." But privately she did not feel so brave. She and Charlotte were not so safe, nor so innocent, as she had thought, and if that sharp-eyed Mr. Darcy were ever to find out about it, she would be reduced to his level. Perhaps it was time she and Charlotte began to think about renouncing the pleasures of girlhood. Charlotte was 27. There was little for her to look forward to in life, and Elizabeth did not like to abandon her friend, or deprive her of the spinster's only solace. But Elizabeth was not yet 21. There was no reason to despair. Surely there were men in the world who liked women, who had fortune enough to marry where they chose, who had wit and humor, and were not unpleasant to look at. She heard the growing list of requirements. Goodness! The odds against marriage for a woman in her situation were almost insurmountable, unless one were willing to compromise. What did a little sodomy matter, where everything else was as desirable as one could wish? She would say nothing to Jane, and hope for the best. Now, if only Elizabeth could find a suitor.